Hi, everyone, or hi to those who have decided to click on this video and listen to what I'll be reading is the Peoplehood Matrix. Specifically, I'm reading the article called Peoplehood, a model for the extension of sovereignty in American Indian studies. Um, I wanted to share this and actually read it because I think this theoretical framework is very useful. It has impacted my own personal life and my sense of belonging, especially as I identify as like a relocated, displaced, um, but also rooted uh, indigenous person. And so for those of you who are doing community organizing work, um, I think it's important to address assumptions that we carry, especially when some of the community work we could be doing, might fall short. Having an understanding of the frameworks that we carry when it comes to doing community organizing helps, at least in my perspective, it helps us do better. And I want to give a shout out to my professor 4 years ago at Cal Poly Pomona, Charles Sepulveda, who taught this and had us read this and analyze this article. Still to this day, this has been a great theoretical framework for organizing. It has brought a lot of clarity, especially bringing in this framework on top of regenerative studies kind of perspectives of community change, healing the environment, regenerating ourselves and our people. So hopefully this is interesting for folks who are joining in, um, and I hope that we can have more conversations and just dive more and sort of see what other frameworks we might be wanting to share with each other, so that we can be part of that healing. So with that said, expressing gratitude again. Forgive me for my voice if I sound annoying. If I'm definitely going to mispronounce certain words, so just bear with me. Let's get started. And before that, I want to also say the title: "Peoplehood: A Model for the Extension of Sovereignty in American Indian Studies." This is written by Tom Holm, J. Diane Pearson, and Ben Chavis. And I'm going to skip the first parts. Not that they're not important, but I do want to dive in more into the concept of peoplehood, just to give a brief overview. But again, apologies if I just overly simplify it. Um, the first pages sort of talk about American Indian studies as a field. Um, and so the issue is that um, when we study Native people, there's a lot of generalizing. And so too much generalizing to where we when we understand psychology or politics or economic studies, we already are using, or I'm assuming this, but we're already assuming our understanding of like Western theories. So this the first few pages are talking about how if you study just one tribe alone, you'd be able to bring about a whole vast amount of information and knowledges alone in just one tribe. You could have its own psychology theories, it has its own political science theories, it has its own sociological theories, its own ethnobotanical knowledge. So every tribe and every people has their own sort of unique and well uh, and rich information. So that was the issue when it comes to studying American Indian studies, is that unlike evolution theory, where we have the ideas of natural selection, um, American Indian studies doesn't really have a clear and concise framework to understand. So this article is actually trying to propose a framework when we want to talk about certain tribes and certain indigenous groups around. We want to be able to have some core assumptions uh, to articulate the richness of every single group of indigenous people as best we can. So feel free to read it. I encourage you to read it. I just wanted to I wanted to dive in more on the peoplehood matrix theory first. So the peoplehood matrix. This essay argues that a core assumption for American Indian studies and a theoretical construct based solely on Native American knowledge have already been formulated and introduced, albeit in a very raw form. During the 1980s, Robert K. Thomas began work on a perceptive and encompassing view of group identity. His formulation went beyond the conventional notions of grouping human beings as members of classes, polities, cultural units, races, or religious groups. He deliberately chose the term, quote unquote, peoplehood to transcend the notions of statehood, nationalism, gender, ethnicity, and sectarian membership. Thomas built his understandings of peoplehood on Edward H. Spicer's definition of cultural enclaves and what he called enduring peoples, quote unquote. In his classic studies, Cycles of Conquest and the Yaquis, A Cultural History, Spicer outlined the thesis that human enclaves were the direct result of colonialism, and that these groups most often were identified as having distinct languages, religions, and territories that the colonizers sought to destroy, or in the case of territory, claim for themselves. In Spicer's honor and to recognize this singular contribution to the discipline of anthropology, George Pierre Castile and Gilbert Kushner brought together a series of essays utilizing the concept in their 1981 book, Persistent Peoples, Cultural Enclaves and Perspective. In his opening essay, Castile raised the idea of persistent peoples, quote unquote, to differentiate it from the notion of ethnicity. As he put it, the notions which swirl around or swirl about the amorphous term ethnic group, ethnic identity, ethnicity, and the like, need to be disassociated from the concept of a people. The same ethnic label has been used to refer to co-religionists, racial isolates, linguistic groups, castes, and persons of common national origin, a range of meanings so vast as to be useless. We intend the term people to label a limited and clearly defined social type. To the three factors that distinguish persistent peoples, Thomas added sacred history, quote unquote, to define peoplehood, quote unquote. This essay is intended to refine and illustrate Thomas's modification of Spicer's original idea and propose that it be utilized as the core assumption of American Indian studies. Thomas and co-author Tom Holm discussed the concept of peoplehood on numerous occasions before Thomas's death in 1991. Thomas perceived that the four factors of peoplehood, language, sacred history, religion, and land, were interwoven and dependent on one another. The connections between the four were somewhat vague at the time, but over the last few years, we have attempted to explain his ideas fully and utilize the concept of peoplehood to serve as a disciplinary model. The matrix itself is universal to all Native American tribes and nations, and possibly to all indigenous groups, and could equally serve as the primary theoretical underpinning of indigenous people studies. The idea that groups of human beings constitute various peoples has always been understood, but no one before Spicer and Thomas really attempted to identify the elements of peoplehood or to explain how these characteristics are dynamically linked together. Understanding the interrelationship of four aspects of peoplehood is essential. No single factor is more important than the others, and all necessarily support each other as well as a particular group's larger sense of identity. Anthropologist Ernest L. Shusky recognized but did not fully elaborate on the universal Native American understanding of this organic interrelationship. As he said, the Sioux or Lakota often spoke of disappearance of their people. When I answered that census figures showed their population increasing, they countered that parts of the reservations were continually being lost. They concluded that there could be no more Indians when there was no more Indian land. Several older men told me that the original sacred pipe given the Lakota in the beginning was getting smaller. The pipe shrank with the loss of land. When the land and pipe disappeared, the Lakota would be gone. Discussions of land, and especially its loss, were cast in emotional tones. I have heard similar tones among Iroquois in the Southwest and in Alaska when land was an issue. For many Native Americans and Indian identity is intertwined with rights to land. Some of the elements of peoplehood can be symbolic of identity, as in the case of a group's holy land that is no longer its homeland. But in the final analysis, the factors of peoplehood make up a complete system that accounts for particular social, cultural, political, economic, and ecological behaviors exhibited by groups of people indigenous to particular territories. The elements of the peoplehood matrix function beyond their use as symbols. The diagram of the peoplehood model shows the four factors as they intertwine, interpenetrate, and interreact. Having a distinct language, of course, sets a group apart in and of itself, but a group particular language, by way of its nuances, references, and grammar, gives a sacred history a meaning of its own, particularly if origin, creation, migration, and other stories are spoken rather than written. Language defines place and vice versa. Place names, for example, essentially bespeak a relationship with the environment or describe an area within the context of the group's sacred history and culture. Particular groups' language is, more often than not, liturgical as well as colloquial. Religious ceremonies are usually performed using a language that is familiar within the group. On the other hand, language can be symbolic, and ritual language might not have meaning in any other context than in a particular religious ceremony. Even English has been adopted and made an essential part of a given people's sense of group identity. Gula, the language of an African American group living off the coast of the Carolinas, is not bad English, quote unquote, but a particular dialect of a particular group of people. The Lumbees, a Native American group, also speak a unique brand of English. The word cooter, quote unquote, for example, is used in Lumbee English for a particular species of box turtle indigenous to the rivers of southern North Carolina and northern South Carolina, the Lumbee homeland. A group's sacred history is told in the vernacular not only to give each member of the group an understanding of where they come from, but also to impart to them proper behavior and the ways in which they maintain group cohesion through ritualism and ceremony. Sacred history also details kinship structures, the meaning of ceremonies as well as when they should be performed, and how the group fits within a particular environment. A people's sacred history is equally an explanation of its own distinct culture, customs, and political economy. Law is derived from within the peoplehood matrix. Every human group maintains some kind of relationship with territory. The relationship might be mechanistic and thought of only in terms of economic worth of a piece of land. Land, from this point of view, is equal to that which it produces or to what its actual market value might be. Another relationship with land is organic in nature. It is a living relationship in which humans use the land and consider it part of their heritage. That is to say, some human groups seem to have a special esteem for the homeland that goes beyond its cash value or level of productivity. Particular territories are always mentioned in sacred histories, and quite often creation and migration stories specify certain landmarks as being especially holy. Ancestors are buried in particular places. Shrines are erected in certain parts and of the immediate environment. Plants, water, earth, animals are often utilized in religious ceremonies. Additionally, if a group has a viable religion, the group must live in the expectation of divine intervention and the creation of more sacred places. Homelands are often considered holy lands, and even when groups migrate or are removed from its original territories, the people continue to attach great meaning to them. Thomas used the term religion, quote unquote, as part of the fourfold peoplehood model. We have modified this idea somewhat and now refer to that particular aspect of peoplehood as a group's ceremonial cycle, quote unquote. This was done primarily to demonstrate how a group's religion is inseparably linked to language, sacred history, and a particular environment. Sacred histories normally explain why and how a ceremony is done. Not only that, but a people's connection with territory provides the times as well as the circumstances under which ceremonies are conducted. Humans, especially those who have living relationships with particular territories, observe and know the cycles of natural events, solstices, equinoxes, salmon runs, buffalo, calving, the blooming of particular plants, the appearance of certain stars or planets that occur at a certain time and place. Ceremonies most often coincide with seasonal, stellar, planetary, solar, floral, or faunal change that occurs above, below, on the surface, or within a group's territorial range. In short, the ceremonial cycle is linked by way of language and sacred history to a particular environment and ecology. It makes up a group's world, quote unquote, and directly affects its worldview. As modified and structured, Thomas's model of peoplehood has vast explanatory potential. For one thing, the model adequately reminds us as scholars that human societies are complex and that Native Americans entwine everyday life with religious practices and a view that human beings are part of rather than an imposition on their environments. This idea is quite different than the Western evolutionary concept of how the world works. To the Darwinian as well as Christian thinker, humans were the last and most complex beings to arise. Hence, the advent of human beings was and is considered in the Western mind an intrusion on ecological systems. The four interlocking aspects of peoplehood demonstrate the futility of this kind of reductionist thought. No single element of the model is more or less important than the others. The environment is an aspect of peoplehood. Consequently, deductive reasoning cannot really reduce group behavior to a single cause. The peoplehood model is a holistic matrix and reflects a much more accurate picture of the ways in which Native Americans act, react, pass along knowledge, and connect with the ordinary as well as the supernatural worlds. Peoplehood as and sovereignty. Beyond the model's value as an ethnological tool, it adds a new political definition that it sorry it adds a new political definition that responsible scholars have to take into consideration in looking at international relations, colonialism, warfare, political sociology, domestic policies, or any one of a number of different fields of study. Over the years, anthropologists, political philosophers, and Western academics in general have developed a hierarchical set of definitions of the ways in which human beings organize themselves socially and politically. The lowest, and to use Western terminology, the most primitive, quote unquote, form of human organization is the band. This socio-political form is defined as a small group, perhaps 20 to 50 people, of hunters or foragers led by informally acknowledged headmen who primarily handles domestic disputes and leads the group in various economic and religious activities. The next step up is the tribe, which incorporates a few thousand people into a single social, but not necessarily political organization. The tribe is considered an association of kin groups that link themselves to a hypothetical or mythical ancestor. There is no central political organization other than an informal council of elders or other acknowledged leaders who lead by example rather than by coercion. An offshoot of the tribe, rather than an evolutionary step, is the chiefdom. A chiefdom can incorporate thousands of people and has a strictly formal, full-time political leader. Essentially, the chiefdom is a tribe with highly centralized political authority. According to anthropological orthodoxy, finally, Western scholars have defined the highest and most quote unquote modern form of socio-political organization as the state. A state is normally thought of as incorporating large numbers of people under a single highly centralized government. The people under the state do not have to be linked to a common ancestor. The government wields the power to collect taxes, draft labor, raise armies, and decree laws. It also uses coercion institutions, such as the police and militaries, to protect the state or enforce its codes of behavior to maintain order. The people under the state are considered its subjects or citizens, who swear absolute allegiance to it. This organizational form, whether under the terms kingdom, city-state, or nation-state, is viewed as civilized, quote unquote, government because it has nearly total control over its members and seeks political efficacy over a well-defined territory. These two narrow definitions and their hierarchical alignment, hierarchical because they are presumed to have evolved in steps from the simple band to the complex state, have led to serious scholarly misconceptions concerning pre-state, quote unquote, or non-state, quote unquote, or uncivilized, quote unquote, peoples who have been subjugated by other states. For example, many political scientists consider Native American treaties to be on quite a different level than other kinds of treaties made between the United States and foreign countries, simply because Native American peoples were defined as tribes rather than states. As tribes or non-states, Native American groups, by definition, had no real or legitimate authority to maintain international relations through treaties. By definition, a non-state or pre-state is not a sovereign entity. Hence, according to this inaccurate overview, Native American treaties are anomalies because they do not carry the weight of treaties made between two or more legitimate states. From that point of view, Chief Justice John Marshall was correct in ruling in the case Cherokee Nation versus Georgia that Native American tribes were domestic dependent nations, quote unquote, not having the status of foreign states to bring a case before the Supreme Court. States are sovereignties. Anything lower on the political scale is not. In other words, these narrow definitions have served to excuse colonialism and justify the unilateral abrogation of Native American treaties by the United States. The concept of peoplehood, however, adds a new dimension to political thought concerning disenfranchised or colonized Native American groups. The concept goes beyond the notion of race and even nationality. Historically, Native American peoples adopted captives of several races. Adoption meant that the captive, regardless of race, became a member of a kin group. His or her new relatives were obligated to assimilate the new family member in terms of the four aspects of peoplehood. Race to Native Americans was not a factor of group identity or peoplehood. Nations, which are primarily viewed as the territorial limits of states that encompass a number of communities, do not necessarily constitute a people, nor do they have the permanency of peoplehood. The Cherokees exist as a people despite intermarriage with other races since the early 1700s, cultural modification, and the rise and fall of the Cherokee Nation during the 19th and early 20th centuries. A people united by a common language and having a particular ceremonial cycle, a unique sacred history, and knowledge of a territory necessarily possess inherent sovereignty. Nations may come and go, but peoples maintain identity even when undergoing profound cultural change. For scholars, the concept of peoplehood might help explain such events as the quick and wholesale breakup of the Soviet Union or the continued resistance by certain peoples to being incorporated by larger, quote unquote, modern states. It could also explain a group's resiliency. Imperialism is nothing less than an economic policy under which a given state seeks to control resources, human or otherwise, outside its own territorial boundaries. Colonization is the physical occupation of territories by an imperial state done to manage this economic policy. Equally, colonization is the attempt to dispossess indigenous groups by denying, undermining, or attacking their existence as peoples. In other words, peoplehood is universally understood, and colonizing powers, to further their own goals, attempt to strip from indigenous groups each of the four aspects of peoplehood through the means of territorial dispossession, assimilation, religious conversion, or outright extermination. Colonization is, in short, the denial of another group's sovereignty on the basis that the group being colonized is unorganized, uncivilized, or lawless. But peoplehood is self-contained and self-governing. Moreover, it predates and is a prerequisite for all other forms of social political organization. In fact, peoplehood, rather than the band or the tribe, is the basis of nationalism and the original organization of states. Conversely, states or nations might not necessarily be considered peoples. Equally, the model of peoplehood serves to explain and define codes of conduct, civility, behavior within a given environment, and relationships between people. What we term law, quote unquote, and the enforcement thereof is unquestionably a part of peoplehood. Sovereignty, therefore, is inherent in being a distinct people. The concept renders terms such as uncivilized, pre-state, and primitive academically useless, except to explain how these inaccurate concepts have been utilized to justify theft, cultural suppression, and genocide. Native American knowledge and philosophies. For those of us in American Indian studies, the concept of peoplehood is important because it better reflects Native American knowledge and philosophies. Native American knowledge is based largely on the understanding of relationships, the interrelationship between human beings, animals, plants, societies, the cosmos, the spirit world, and the function of other natural, even catastrophic occurrences. The peoplehood model is intrinsically multifaceted in conception and thus does not allow knowledge to be fragmented. The extraordinary persistence of peoplehood is a study in and of itself. Many Native American peoples have undergone change without losing their sense of group identity. The occurrence of syncretic change is especially interesting. Native American peoples have taken foreign ideas, institutions, and material goods, filtered them through the matrix of peoplehood, and given them meaning within their own cultures and societies. The crucial element in syncretic change is a degree of autonomy. The Cherokee, Tohono O'odham, and Yoemi peoples, for example, have developed distinct forms of native Christianity, largely because they were able to utilize their own languages in its practice. They were able to work it into the chronology of their own sacred histories, correlate Christian philosophies, if not practices, with their traditional codes of behavior, synchronize and relate Christian rituals with their own ceremonial cycle, and tie Christianity with well-known or intrinsically sacred sites. The peoplehood model opens up a new era in literary studies as well. More often than not, writings by Native Americans are compared to the established Western literary canon. These comparisons are often without substance simply because much of Native American literature is the literature of peoplehood rather than of individual alienation or conflict. Many of the protagonists in Native American literature are participating or semi-participating members of a Native group who become entangled or trapped in the white world and who eventually return to their Native roots for renewal and healing. Most Native American literature contains this kind of cyclical or at least nonlinear structure and recognizes the holistic nature of the societies that these protagonists leave and to which they return. The land, the ceremonies, the language, and the stories drawn from the Native group's sacred history make the protagonist whole and resolve his or her conflicts. Native American literary protagonists are seemingly always caught in the middle of two worlds, but instead of actually becoming marginalized, they are rejuvenated by being reintroduced to their own sense of peoplehood. Native American literature, then, has its own form. Similarly, other Native American art forms might be examined for their peoplehood, quote unquote, content. The concept of peoplehood has value as a general model for applied research. For years, Native American peoples have called on scholars to be responsible with the information given to them and responsive to the needs of the communities they study. Native American concerns seem to boil down to maintaining distinct group identities while, at the same time, bettering individual tribal economies and reasserting tribal rights of sovereignty. Giving something back to the people whom one studies is imperative. but it also raises questions about academic freedom and the relevancy of particular studies to Native American communities. For example, linguistic studies are extremely important to the preservation of a group's identity. But what can linguistic studies do beyond writing grammar books, compiling a complete dictionary, creating a pedagogy for teaching the language, or making tapes of native speakers? Does the creation of the projects open up new areas of study, or, from a practical point of view, effectively end scholarly inquiry? The answer to these questions lies in emphasizing the linkages between language, place, ceremony, and history. Practically anyone can learn a native language, but without the understanding of its intricacies and its nuances in terms of preserving and passing along the knowledge of the people who speak it, the language is rendered useless. Language is not primary. It is simply an equal part of the matrix. As it stands, the model can be used as an indicator of Native American behavior in terms of political participation, economic activities, land use, and even how learning takes place. Identity, especially identification within a particular group, seems to be a primary human concern and a constant in human history. Cultures tend to perpetuate themselves, and humans consistently behave conservatively. As Edmund Burke pointed out 2 centuries ago, people cling to institutions, struggle to maintain their distinct communities, and tend to view change as a terribly painful process that rarely takes place without damaging society or culture. Even well thought out, perfectly rational changes can cause serious injury to peoples, especially if one or more of the four factors of peoplehood is attacked, modified by outside forces, or destroyed completely. A good example of perceived rational change gone wrong is the sheep reduction program foisted on the Navajo people during the 1930s. Prior to the Great Depression, the Navajos had developed a pastoral society and culture based on herding sheep. The animals had been incorporated into the Navajo sacred history and into the tribe's ceremonial cycle. The Navajos utilized specific language for sheep herding and developed wool weaving into a uniquely Navajo art form. They ritually slaughtered the animals and held feasts that led to the formation of alliances between families through intermarriage and generally amicable social interactions. Bride prices were paid in sheep, and Navajo religious ceremonies were not considered complete without feeding the participants great quantities of mutton stew. The pastoral economy fitted into the ecology of the reservation. Sheep herds were moved seasonally to different pastures and water holes. Just before the Great Depression, government studies indicated that Navajo lands could not sustain any more growth in sheep production. Overgrazing was becoming a problem, and there was a surplus, quote unquote, of animals on the reservation. Consequently, the government, following the economic law, quote unquote, of supply and demand, decided that the Navajos had too many sheep. By reducing the number of sheep they possessed, the Navajos presumably could conserve their existing forage acreage and demand higher prices for their wool. Ultimately, the plan was a disaster. Internal relationships became strained. Family and individual status took on new meaning. Ceremonies were modified, and the cherished idea of ecological harmony in Navajo worldviews was all but destroyed. The sheep reduction program, for all of its economic rationality, did not fit the Navajo sense of peoplehood. Those who advocated its adoption failed to understand that a market-based economy was not necessarily a universal system, and that change must be syncretic rather than mechanistic. Scholars who do applied research must, therefore, make certain that their ideas have meaning within the context of the peoplehood model. Traditional academic disciplines tend to compartmentalize and fragment knowledge. They develop models, paradigms, or core assumptions that are rarely questioned internally. Indeed, they may even have become articles of faith rather than accurate pictures of how the world works. An academic discipline either builds on or discovers variables within a theory particular to itself and develops a jargon or set of definitions all its own. Thomas's model of peoplehood is an accurate and functional academic definition based on internally generated information. Moreover, it reminds us that the essence of Native American knowledge is the understanding of how things are interrelated and are continuously interacting. Peoples are unique unto themselves, and human behavior is relative to the human understanding of who they are. The peoplehood model is a core assumption on which any methodology, whether qualitative or quantitative, can be applied. For American Indian studies, it meets the criteria of disciplinary core assumption and should be given serious scholarly consideration. So hopefully, after reading this, there's some questions, there's some thoughts, there's some things to contemplate. Um, I mean, I could go on and give my whole spiel about it, but I just wanted to share this. I'll try to add a link to the PDF so that you can read it. And yeah, hopefully this was interesting, and there was things you can take apart from this and apply it to your own life and your own organizing efforts. But with that said, thank you, and I hope you have a good week, good day. Thank you.